Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Grace Murray, Head of Public Programs at the Freer and Sackler, Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art. I'm delighted to welcome you to our program, Moment of Zen, which is the first in a series of 3 talks about religion and spirituality in the museum. At the Freer and Sackler, our collection reflects religious diversity from around the world, and we believe that museums can be spaces of solace and spiritual reflection, which are needed now more than ever. These talks are part of an initiative to consider how we present, display, and interpret religion in our galleries and beyond. We hope you enjoyed tonight's event and that you'll come back and join us next week on Wednesday, July 29th at 6 p.m. for the next talk in this series, Conversations about Museums and Healing, which will feature an interview with Smithsonian Secretary Loni Bunch and a discussion with journalist Krista Tippett. On August 5th, we will hold the final talk in the series, Spirituality and the Art Museum in Contemporary America. I would like to thank the Lilly Foundation for their generous support, which has made these events possible. Our focus tonight is on Zen Buddhist art and practice. The hashtag Museum Moment of Zen has been trending on social media during the pandemic, with the term Zen signifying calm in general. But tonight, we would like to ask, what is Zen really? What are its basic principles? How did it originate? And why is it popular today? In these turbulent times, what can Zen traditions teach us? To help answer these questions, we have 3 guests joining us. Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams is a writer, activist, and ordained Zen priest who defies all titles, descriptors, and categories. She's the founder of the Center for Transformative Change and the author of Being Black, Zen and the Art of Living with Fearlessness and Grace, and co-author of Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation. She's joining us today from Berkeley, California. Yukio Lippit is professor of history of art and architecture at Harvard University. His research interests center on Japanese painting of the medieval and early modern eras, as well as the history of Japanese architecture. He's the author of numerous books and articles, including Japanese Zen Buddhism and the Impossible Painting. He's joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. And finally, Frank Feltons is Japan Foundation Assistant Curator of Japanese Art at the Freer and Sackler. He's a specialist in Japanese art with a focus on the late medieval and early modern, including Japanese photography and the intersections between painting and ceramics. He's also the curator of the exhibition Hokusai, Mad About Painting, and he joins us tonight from Washington, D.C. Frank Feltons will introduce us to some artworks in the museum collection, and then we're going to move into an open conversation among our 3 panelists about their perspectives on Zen. Throughout the conversation, please add your comments and questions to the chat here on YouTube, and we'll address as many of them as we can. Be sure to log into your YouTube account so that you can comment. You can also email questions to us at asiaprograms@si.edu. But first, I would like to begin the program by welcoming Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams and asking her to lead us in a moment of mindfulness.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us here on this really beautiful and very timely program. I'm just going to take a moment and invite all of us to bring ourselves present to this particular place, a virtual place of togetherness, and inviting us to leave behind for just this period of time that we're together here. We're leaving behind the movement and flurry of all of our days, the many different places that we are at and located. This is a moment in which we can bring ourselves present for the discussion, for enjoying the art, and really allowing ourselves to just come to a bit more ease, a bit more rest. And the way that I most like to do that is to invite ourselves to reconnect with the earth, and we do that primarily and first and foremost through our feet. And remembering that we have feet that are connected to the earth, even if we're on the floor, even if we have shoes, that we can find our feet as our way of rooting the place that we are here and now. Even if you happen to be walking or even lying down, you can find your feet, perhaps wiggle your toes, this very embodied way of bringing ourselves into this particular moment in this place, drawing our attention and as we draw our attention to the sensations of our own body, oftentimes we become aware of our breath, so we can also use our breath as a way to presence ourselves as we draw a breath in and draw breath out, allowing the weight of our body to settle and finding and connecting to our seat, our buttocks, bringing us into a three-dimensional presence of not just our neck on our head, above the shoulders, but really feeling into the weightiness of your own body. Noticing the rise and fall of your chest, your breath. Allowing your sense of fullness and the sensations on your skin to be more in your present awareness. Maybe allowing yourself to take a breath in and drawing your shoulders up a little bit towards your ears. We can all use a moment of releasing the tension that we carry, the burden on our shoulders, on our back, and our neck. Just as we allow the breath to leave our body on an out breath, again, feeling the weight of our body settling, allowing ourselves to land in the width of our body. We connect to the world around us, connect to the sense of space on either side of us, the presence of all of our comrades on this journey of art and connection to Zen here at this time. You can imagine them all in a room with you. Taking a breath in, extending your crown towards the sky, and just allowing yourself to connect to your own sense of dignity. As you allow your attention to drop down, feeling that the energy being held in your belly, allowing your belly to be soft, jaw to be soft, neck to be soft, shoulders soft, chest, belly, hips, thighs, all the way down to your calves and ankles. Letting a little bit of the day just drop away. And then just one more in-breath. Perhaps filling the lungs as much as you can and more before releasing a nice long out-breath if the conditions allow, maybe even with sound. As you release the moment before you arrived to that time and bring yourself present to this moment now so we can enjoy our moment of Zen together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reverend Angel, for this grounding moment, which really is the perfect segue to our discussion today. And I also want to say hello to all of you who are watching from wherever you are right now. We are here today to think about Zen and contemplate what it is, and also explore how museums might be inspired by this ancient religion and philosophy in our own turbulent times right now. If we could pull up the PowerPoint, that would be fantastic. I want to preface our discussion today by briefly introducing an exhibition that the Freer Gallery of Art is conceiving in a time of unprecedented challenges and uncertainties, and also an unprecedented time of reshuffling of old norms. Zen today is one of perhaps the most successful global exports. And if you think about Zen historically, it is of course a part of Buddhism and originated in China before making its way to Korea and in the 13th century to Japan. And of course, we know the religion by its Japanese name now, Zen. In the 20th century, Zen came to the West, particularly to the United States. And in the post-World War II decades, Zen has inspired countless cultural figures and artists like Franz Klein and John Cage, to name just a few. Today, Zen in America really has taken on a life of its own and can be anything from a lifestyle to a deep-rooted belief and philosophy. Zen, to me, and I think to our guests today and to many of you out there, has always been something flexible and international and remains to be that way. If we can go to the next slide. So the exhibition Mind Over Matter takes a look at the beginning and peak of Zen in Japan. In other words, the Zen that eventually came to America. So it's a good segue into our discussion today from a historical perspective. We will be hearing more about the historic side of Zen from Professor Lippit, who's joining us today, and about the contemporary Zen from Reverend Angel. So suffice it to say that the Zen monasteries of medieval Japan took inspiration from artworks from China, such as the painting that you see on the right here, which is a Chinese work that made its way to Japan. And the Japanese took these works of art from China and formulated an aesthetic system around them that still resonates with common notions associated with Zen today. For example, what almost stereotypical notions that we associate with Japan, like contemplativeness, stillness, simplicity, all find their roots more or less in one way or another in that medieval Zen that you see here on the screen. And just to say a couple of things about those two other works, the one in the center and the one on the left are both Japanese works, but made in response to pieces that came in from China. So there on the single slide alone, you see the international aspect of Zen, as it were. And we will be speaking a little bit about the contemporary aspect of that internationality. Just to end with the next slide, please. I want to just end here by showing you these artworks in combination. And as you see here, Zen did not just emerge or engage with paintings. Zen was practiced in monasteries in medieval Japan in a highly codified, aestheticized environment. And programs of objects of the kind that you see here, ceramics, lacquer, paintings, all genres of art that came from various places in East Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, and other places such as Southeast Asia were combined in these Zen monasteries to really form the setting for religious practice. So physical objects formed the environment for practices of the mind. And with that in mind, I don't want to belabor this any much further. I want to give the floor to our distinguished guests today, who together combine such a deep knowledge of the historical and contemporary manifestations of Zen. And today, together, I would like to, like Grace said, contemplate how Zen is practiced today and how it was practiced in the distant past, and what lessons we can take away from that, from the contemporary practice and from the historical side, to aid us in our daily lives, if you will, but also how museums use and display Zen and display art. Welcome, Reverend Angel. Welcome back, and welcome, Professor Lippit.
Thank you.
And I kind of want to drop the bombshell right at the beginning by starting with what is perhaps the most simple, but also the most difficult question of all. What is Zen, really? And what is your personal connection to that philosophy and religion? And if we may start with Reverend Angel and move our way from the present back in time, that would be fantastic.
Did you say go from the present back in time?
That's right.
Yeah. You know, for me, Zen has become, I think, primarily a way of engaging my life. It's I think to say philosophy would even put it more in my head than it actually lives. But to say that it is a way, I mean, in the sense that many of us have seen the notion of a capital W way or a path. It is a lens, a path, a way in which to both meet the truth of my life and also to reflect on it. Right? It's both the path and it's also the way in which I measure how I'm walking the path of my life. It's a formal training. It has also been formal training for me. So I'm trained in the tradition of being a Zen priest, and that's what my garb is about. And I have entered into the path of Zen maybe more than 20, almost 30 years ago now, and it's become an intrinsic part of my life. And so, quite early in my young adult years, I ran across, in fact, a piece of art called the Enso, and it's a large circle, and many of us have seen it and can relate to it in some way as like that is quintessential Zen. But I was struck quite immediately by the power and the energy of that particular depiction that was both something there, but also vast and a great deal of space and allowance, I would say a lot of allowance for me to be who I am and kind of take the art in, you know, just as it needed to strike me in that moment. And for me, that particular moment captures my entire relationship to Zen. It took me, a couple of decades to actually get around to that. But the most immediate moment, my most prime moment with Zen and touching it and the immediacy is what I've come back around to, is that ultimately what Zen is how it is that you take in life and the willingness, the practice that is involved in creating a willingness for you to just receive life as it is, to not intellectualize it, to not try to fit it in the ideas that you have come with from previous moments in time, but really to experience your life as directly as possible, to experience people as directly as possible, to experience yourself as directly as possible. So for me, that is what Zen is.
I want to come back to some of those points in a little bit. Professor Lipid, if you could add your own perspective of what Zen is.
Sure. Well, I'm a historian of art, and I specialize in the arts related to Zen Buddhism in particular. And so I would approach this question from that perspective. And for me, just to start off with, I think Zen is just such a remarkable, fascinating, and important part of world culture and human experience in many different parts of the world and many different communities. And it's been fascinating to see it develop in a way that distinguishes it even from other forms of Buddhism. The claims to, the idea that Zen Buddhists inherit and preserve and transmit a special understanding of the historical Buddha's teachings outside of the scripture. So a non-textual, instinctive, intuitive transmission from mind to mind that is not earned through textual study, but through somatic practices such as meditation, one-on-one training sessions with a master, the struggle with Zen koan, or kind of riddles of logic and language, if you will, and mindful labor. And, this is an interesting set of emphases, and historians will argue over the degree to which, any given monastic community was true to these emphases. But it was a powerful defining kind of force for these communities. And that was particularly fascinating, of course, for me, and has been raised by Reverend Angel's invocation of the Enso, is that painting is extremely important for these communities. Zen Buddhists painted. Many monks historically painted artworks, and it's worth, I think, asking why. There's something about painting that communicates teachings and principles and ideas in Zen in a way that words can't. And that, for me, is simply fascinating and remarkable, and has kind of sustained my own interest over many years in these cultures and these traditions.
I think both of you have touched on two very interesting points, and I'm from my own limited understanding of what Zen is and what it has been and what it is now. I think the biggest difference is perhaps that in the past, in medieval Japan, say, Zen was confined as a religion to the monastic context, whereas now, and as Reverend Angel has described it so nicely just a few minutes ago, it is also a way of life in many ways today. Or you are, of course, a ordained priest, but I remember you've written elsewhere that Zen can be a part of whatever faith you might have, right? You can just add layers of it to it. And if both of you could speak a little bit about these, about, for example, Reverend Angel, what the everyday aspect of Zen is or can be, and Professor Lipid, how would we picture a medieval Zen monastery, life in a medieval monastery to look like? Just to put sort of a dimension of life and personal experience to that religion.
Yeah. I think what I would, like to offer is that, just from my own personal perspective, perhaps the most striking thing is, there many times people will say, like, what is Zen? But also, like, and Zen, for those of you that don't know, essentially means meditation. So it really is the meditation school, right? The word itself comes from the Sanskrit, and it trickles down through Chinese and then to Japanese. And so Zen means meditation school. And the idea is that meditation, or zazen, seated meditation, is the primary means of apprehending one's own understanding, or a deep, like, embodied understanding. So when we say understanding, we think of something up here, but the embodied understanding, as Professor Lippit spoke about, through a somatic, direct experience way. Zazen is the way that we do that, and it's the way that we come to understand the nature of our own mind. And when we understand the nature of our own mind, and the concept of mind is distinct in Zen. It's distinct in general from the West versus the East, but it's also even more distinct in Zen. And so the mind is something more like, both the heart and the mind, not just the things that are kind of rummaging around in our heads. And as we apprehend by observation and by willingness to be present to the nature of our mind, and meet it directly, like, oh, this is what mind does, right? Without a kind of chattering happening in it. This very, very direct, like, experiencing of mind. the idea is that when we experience our own mind, we experience all things. And so what I say to people is, they ask me about what is meditation. I think in that word, I always say also what is Zen, and I think it is relationship. And so the way that looks in my daily life, there's a glass here by me, and how I relate to the glass, or just the touching of the glass, the intimacy of my relationship with all of the things that I touch and that I move through my life with, is the manifestation of that practice of Zen, that things have their own life force, whether they're animate objects or inanimate objects, that everything has its own aliveness and potency and vibrancy, and you can see that and be awake and aware to it, rather than kind of closing down to the narrow view of just what it is that you're focusing on in any given moment. That there's a way, path of being willing to allow everything to have its own particular nature that you are in relationship with at any given moment. And somehow that willingness to allow things to be as they are gives you permission to be as you are, and then there's a collapsing of the distinction between subject and object. And so Zen as a practice, as a path, gives way to both an alertness and a receptivity to one's own life.
And Professor Lipid, if you could say a few words about. I'm just trying to picture what the life in Kyoto and in one of the big urban Zen temples must have looked like, vis-a-vis what Reverend Angel was just describing to us, as a felt experience. And if you could also talk about a little bit about how artworks play into that kind of daily routine or practice.
Well, medieval Zen monasteries can be very opaque to in the historical record, but we do have some idea of what was going on. There were aspects of Zen monasteries which are similar to other kinds of Buddhist monasteries. There are many ceremonies and ritual. We know from monastic codes they were very regimented daily schedules and yearly calendars of observations. But it's important to remember they were also havens from what was going on outside the monastic walls, so to speak. And medieval Japan was a war-torn country. It was characterized by warrior rule, internecine warfare, and the latter half of the medieval period descends into a period famously known as the Warring States era, where Japan was decentralized, politically fractured. There was a great deal of violence. And so the Zen monasteries were relational to what was going on outside, and really the antithesis of much of what was going on in the culture of the outside world. And we also know that, some of the aspects of the way Zen monks approached spiritual study involved kind of observation and discipline of daily practice, but in a way that kind of tried to get away from goal-orientedness. And this is really fascinating. We have biographies, for example, of the founder of Daitokuji, the National Master Daito, who struggles with a given koan. Does the dog have a Buddha nature? And this is when he's in training in a Kamakura monastery, and he struggles, and he becomes despondent. He becomes kind of you might say crestfallen and loses confidence. And there's this wonderful description of him returning to his monk cell and tossing his metal key on the wooden table, and as soon as it hits the table, there's a clang which snaps him into a sudden kind of a realization. Thinks the sky opens up, things look different. They feel different. They're sensorially different. And it's moments like that of kind of unexpectedness which arrive because of the constant focus on the present and the task at hand, and something we might call mindfulness. And that's how I imagine many of the paintings that have come down to us today must have functioned. They presuppose a community that's focused on their practice and other things. And paintings are encountered, and they're made and exchanged. Sometimes they're received, sometimes they're chanced upon serendipitously. And some of them, they may prove to be a catalyst like that. They may prove to suddenly be that metal key that strikes the wooden table, that kind of acoustic trigger, a catalyst that puts you into that gets you out of your mind and gets you out of yourself. And another reason why I think these paintings are can be so interesting in that regard, and can they have a lot of, you might say, potentiality, latency still in them. Yes.
That is an excellent segue to showing a few images, actually. If we could pull up the first painting, calligraphy, actually. And I was so pleased to hear that, or interested and intrigued to hear that Reverend Angel's entree to Zen was also through art, through the Enso, but not just that. You know and appreciate this particular calligraphy. So this is fantastic, and it's also going to be in the exhibition that Professor Lippit and I are planning. And it's one of our most recent acquisitions. It's a gift from Mary and Cheney Coles in Seattle. And if we could just think about this work, Professor Lippit, could you enlighten us who made it and who that person was?
Well, this is a piece of calligraphy by one of the most celebrated Zen monks in medieval Japan, a figure by the name of Yukio, who lived by and large during the mid to late 15th century. He's associated with one of the most famous Zen monasteries in Kyoto, Daitokuji, and was a giant figure in the Zen world of his time, who railed against the corruption and kind of sterility of the Zen world he saw around him. He did a great deal to expand the interest in Zen among communities outside of the limited group of members of the elite status groups that until then had been patrons. And so he recruited merchants and other figures, and he was very interested in the arts. He wrote poetry, he painted, and he had a dynamic way of inscribing calligraphy, which you see here.
Reverend Angel, you have seen this work in the flesh in Portland, I believe. Can you describe a little bit how you see this piece of calligraphy?
Yeah, it's funny because as I'm looking at it on the screen now, I feel that same sense of the mind attempting to grasp it, to hold on to it. I can feel my mind like sort of wandering over these characters, wanting to make sense of it, and the practice that kicks in is to like let that go, and particularly the heart is the sort of like explosive, vibrant and dynamic heart is a little bit going a little bit lower on the image there, that just calls like for the rest, to calls me into rest. There's so this piece here. So as having practiced Zen for some time and also studied calligraphy myself, I can certainly make out some of the characters, and I can see mind going, oh, san, there goes there goes person, there goes and there is this and none of that is actually the point. right? The point is to simply allow this dynamic energy, this rhythm and flow of life that in this particular conversation or this expression of, of a dialogue, there is all of the movement, all of the energy of life, and I can give myself that moment of pause to be present with the not having to know all of the words or what was being said, but rather the communication of it that is entering you right there. That there is an invitation to just let the imagery, the energy of it, you could see the movement of EQ's body, right? To even just to make those kinds of strokes, and to let myself enter that rather than having to know what it means or know what it says. There's that layer as well. But the path, if you will, is to allow that to be the thing that is informing you first and foremost, before the intellectual grasping, before the having to know what it is, before the smalling down into the field of knowledge that we have, that actually begins to make us feel small. Oh, I don't know what that is, right? And then we're kind of working against it rather than allowing ourselves to enter into it. And so that's what I see, and that's what resonates for me. I'm so happy that you all have it. I've seen it in person. It strikes me the same way every time. Both the as Professor Lippit was saying, the struggle with the effort to try to grasp things and wanting to know, and then the giving up into just the presence with it, the key striking on the table, right? Just, I can kind of, move my mind all over the place, and there's nothing to grasp onto. There's just the release of allowing it to touch me, to let all of its energy just to be there, and allow myself to be there with it. And I think that my sense of my own practice in calligraphy is that ink allows for an immediacy. You can't just go and scratch it out, and you can't go, oh, okay, I made a mistake there. There's an immediacy, and you're capturing it. It is the perfect medium to capture this sense of the immediacy of your state of mind and present. It's right there. There's no hiding it. And that is what we practice into, being willing to not hide. And I think that that's what so much of Zen painting is about. It is about allowing oneself to be immediate. And I think we practice it because we can see the evidence of our hesitation. We can see the evidence of our wanting to shrink or hide or slow down, rather than just giving ourselves over as we are. And that's very much what the Zen form, the particular form of Zen painting, I think, gives rise to and allows us to practice.
Before we move on to the questions and answers, I want to give our audience as much time to ask you questions as possible. I want to spend a few minutes thinking about how, as a museum, if we make an exhibition on Zen as we are planning now, and particularly in this day and age where you just have to open the newspaper in the morning and you will not find many pleasant news. So there is old norms are being undone. Some of it is very good, some of it is very disturbing. And what can especially Zen and an exhibition about Zen offer to people who emerge, say, from this pandemic and the troubles of our time? And that question is for both of you. Professor Lipid, if we could start with you.
Well, I would like to kind of continue in the wake of what Reverend Angel was just discussing and kind of handling this question. And these are works that convey a kind of that convey a potentially catalytic role in their home environments. And they are also the traces of bodily movement. Wonderful description by Reverend Angel of Yukio's kind of movement here. You know, from his perspective, he is writing out a kind of very common Zen encounter, a legendary encounter between a famous Chinese poet who's kind of bested in a debate by a prominent Zen monk. But after a certain point, he kind of, loses control, or just kind of breaks the boundaries of what calligraphy is supposed to be. You know, calligraphy has a rhythm, it has a pace, it has intervals, it has a meter, much like classical poetry has a meter. And those become disregarded as one kind of moves into the second and third columns here. And, conveying the pace and the real-time performance of that release, that break, to contemporary audiences is, I think, an enormous challenge and has enormous rewards. That finding a kind of an alignment between the bodily movements and the gestures and the kind of effort to break out of mind that is is manifest in some of these artworks in the present, and to make them catalytic in the present in a museum environment is, I think, an enormous challenge, but also a magical kind of event if it can be pulled off.
Reverend Angel, you have spoken about, the world as the field of practice and about the need to achieving ourselves. So if you could, and I know you, Zen inspires your work in social justice and transformative change. And from that perspective, and from the perspective as a practitioner, if you could speak a little bit to that question.
Yeah, I think so much of what plagues us in how we live our lives is that we are clinging to the past. We are what most of us perceive as our present is a repetition of past ideas. It's a repetition of past beliefs. It's a repetition of past forms, past traditions, past ways of doing things, past ways of seeing things. And we are in this moment, the warring states period, if you will, of our time, in which, through globally, in which we are wrestling with the perception of past versus the perception of giving space for the emergence of our complexity. To the complexity we have around gender, to complexity of race, the complexity of where we live at the intersections of race and gender and class and and religion and all of these things. And so, for me, one of the most potent poems of Zen, and the one that I live with most, is the Shin Shin Ming, and it's means something like verses of the faith mind. And the core message I take out of it is. And it's associated with perhaps the quote is most related, that is most referenced by, is not two, right? This notion of not the binaries. And so here we have this, this poem that is from, I think, Professor Lippit, you tell me, is it 3rd century or something like that? Can you tell me, is it 6th century?
It's a bit, this will be a bit later.
Yeah.
The setting is the 8th century, yes.
Yeah, and now we've come to the 8th century, and that it is expressing this singular idea that in many ways we could think of as like this modern idea that people are not, binary in their gender. They're not just male or female, but that we're, more of a complexity, that we kind of like go across the span of things. The notion of intersectionality, that we're not just we're not one identity or another. And there it was in 8th century Japan being said and uttered and expressed, not two. And that the suffering that exists for us is the being caught in the binaries, in the blue and red, and the Republican and Democrat, and the conservative and liberal, and the right and the left, and the black and the white, and so the fixation on binaries, the fixation on trying to get the entire world to collapse into one limited idea of it causes a great deal of suffering, and we see that suffering play out in many different ways. Fixedness is Zen's particular emphasis to release ourselves from fixation, from getting fixed about the way that things are. And so our forms, in theory, we practice in modern monasteries, some true to what we at least imagine, faithful to the height times of the height of Zen. Much of the practice is like these forms that seem at first quite rigid, very specific. The days move like this, the schedules move like this, but the idea is to find freedom and rhythm, liberation inside of the constraints, because we're exchanging the idea that we are constrained by the forms, but rather we're constrained by the ways that we relate to the forms. And similarly, in the environment that we are experiencing right now, I think that many people are in a new expression of our former sense of what tribalism is about. We talk a lot about tribalism, and so much of our attention is about, I belong here, belong there. But I think that one of the things we see emerging now, and that is causing great tension, is a new way of relating to difference that causes real tension with the previous ways, or sort of one could say that the previous paradigms of our relationship to differences, that we connect with people that are like us, and that we can fix people in particular sets of identities, and that's how we know we're safe. And I think we're emerging into a time where our sense of aliveness, there's a crop of people, if you will, that are emerging into a sense of aliveness that comes from being able to relate to difference, and to allow difference to be a part of how we receive life, rather than needing it to fix neatly into boxes. That's not to say that people that are invested in traditions, because Zen is very invested in traditions, are wrong or bad. But I think what we're seeing is a clash in those ways of relating to what is the natural order, of life, that to allow for people to be, of other genders is kind of against the order, one might say. But one could also say that we were never two. We were never just two. We are not two. We are all of one nature, and how we express it is just various manifestations of just one divine nature, or one essential nature. That's the koan. Does the dog have Buddha nature? And I'm going to spoil the plot. It's essentially, that's not the question. The answer is that's not the question at all. That our minds are fixated on the wrong question of trying to get things to fit either this or that. And so that's I think our great struggle now is, can we allow for the many expressions that human beings have evolved into, and let that unfold without that being dangerous or threatening to us. And much of what we're dealing with social justice is very much about that.
I think you're raising some very important points, and I think that a lot of especially from my own perspective, historic Zen can answer, or perhaps not answer, but provide some kind of inspiration or basis for discussion on a lot of the points that you raised. I mean, Zen is not a black and white religion, and it's as you've put it, I mean, it's not a religion that thinks in binaries. It's much more broader and encompassing faith in this kind of manner, and particularly today. I would like to give our audience the chance to ask questions. I think we have quite a few. Grace?
Yeah, it's coming in the chat. One, we're interested that we should, they were interested in help like that, and can you ask the translation available?
Grace, I think you could you ask that question again? I think we had a hard time hearing you. There was a little bit of a delay.
Sure. The quack of calligraphy, and you says is text available of it.
While Grace is fixing her problem, I'm going to take over and I'm going to take a quick look at the. There is a question about the artwork that we showed by EQ. Is it known if the scroll was created in one session, or is it worked on over more than one session? Is there an answer to that?
One session.
One session.
One session.
That's an easy answer. Not as difficult as a koan.
One session, but of course with an arc to it. So it may start off with a certain temporality that gets frenetic, and one of the wonderful things about ink painting is it directly conveys that change in tempo and pace, that drive, that burst, the disruption of the calligraphy that we see. So there is a real visual correspondence to the temporality of the occasion that, of course, can be imagined and followed by looking at it.
Following up on that question, and you've touched upon the fact that this calligraphy uses a Chinese anecdote. The one question is, could you comment upon the Zen Chan school as a vessel of pre-modern Sino-Japanese cultural exchange? Basically going back to that international aspect of Zen.
Yes, Zen, Reverend Angel has used the word transcend. Zen is essentially has its origins in China, but looks back to Indian leaders. It locates, its teachings in the historical Buddha Shakyamuni and an Indian monk Bodhidharma, spreads to Vietnam and Korea, but it's Japan really that transmits Zen to the modern world. And so it's in Zen has sedimented all of these different approaches and priorities and practices and concerns of different communities around the Buddhist world and then around the kind of global world in the modern era. And in Japan, one of the things that people really, I think, that drew people to Zen was that it was also associated with Chinese culture at large. Some of the works, Frank, that you showed at the outset, the lacquerware, the porcelain, the ceramics, were very closely associated with Zen monasteries and the culture of Zen monasteries. And when you entered a Zen monastery, you were entering a kind of a slightly different international space, you might say. It was, and the circuits of the Zen macro culture didn't conform to the national boundaries of the time. So a great deal of Chinese learning, of Chinese approaches to religion, such as spontaneity, which you might say is also an influence of Taoism upon Buddhism through Zen. And this material culture was a very big part of the appeal of Zen in medieval Japan. And it was truly, in that regard, something that could be called a Sino-Japanese culture as well.
Reverend Angel, if you could, just out of personal interest, and I'm sure this is also of interest to our audience, if you could say a few more words about, I was intrigued by your experience with the Enso. If you could say a little bit more about that initial experience that you had with this particular genre, and if you could also say a few words about, what is Zen in America like in the present, if there is an answer to that.
Yeah, if there's an answer to that, well, I mean, it should not be no surprise that I'm a rare creature, less so these days, but as a Black queer woman, not particularly common. Black people in general, African Americans, Black folks in Zen are fairly rare, and so if you could imagine, for myself at the time, I'm like a New Yorker. Grew up my life in New York, urban, very young, and all of the things that come when I'm equally of the hip hop era as I am of Zen tradition. And so, these oftentimes what happens is, and I say this because oftentimes we go, oh, there's the label, that person is a Zen person, and we can kind of discard the rest of the context in which they arise from. And so I would say that, as a New Yorker that grew up with Zen kind of like alongside my path, I also grew up with all of the things you would think of as a, young Black woman in New York. I grew up with lots of, Jewish friends. I grew up, amongst people that were, Italian and Irish. My dad is a fireman. And so I have all of these influences are also going in. I cannot inhabit, solely the Zen uniform, if you will. And that's a very important aspect of understanding even, what American Zen looks like, is that it in and of itself, it is a microcosm of what Zen has been throughout history, is this kind of like picking, and Buddhism in general, this sort of picking up of cultures and moving through. That, we can look at and we go, oh, that's Zen, but it's like Zen is always, or in Buddhism in many ways, is always this this confluence of its history and also what it is contacting in this particular moment, right? It's like this whole lineage from the Buddha and the first patriarch, if you will, of Zen, the Mahakasyapa, down to Bodhidharma and all of the so-called Zen patriarchs, to these very ordinary people that you may be walking on the street with these days. And so there I was, a young person, and it felt like I was in that period of time that you're figuring yourself out culturally, like what are the things that you like and resonate for you. And I thought that art didn't particularly resonate for me until I walked into I don't even remember now where exactly it was that I saw it, but I walked into a place and there was hanging this enormous circle. So and so it refers to the open circle. And it was both, it's like thick and vibrant. It kind of like, look at the thickness of the EQ painting, thick and vibrant, kind of encapsulating everything, but also with an opening. And in that moment, I felt a kind of acceptance for, like, in seeing that, like an accepting for myself, in which I was both held, but there was room for allowing me to grow and to not be trapped. So the circle that is open says something about containment, but also not limits, right? That there is a containment, but also not limits. And that appealed to my particular sensibilities. And I looked down and I was like, well, what is this thing? And I looked down and there was a little placard and it said Zen painting. And so it said Zen painting. And at least that's all I remember, because I hurried away and went and found every book I could find on Zen. And it turned out it was a book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, that first stuck with me by, now a quite renowned Zen monk and priest, Suzuki Roshi, who is responsible for establishing the oldest Zen monastery, what is now an American Zen monastery, the oldest Zen monastery in the country. out here in the West in Tassajara Zen Monastery that came out of the San Francisco Zen Center. And so it was striking, it was that moment when you look at something and it's kind of like finding a lover, and you know that, they're who you have to be with. And so even though I didn't see anyone that looked like me, and that's what American Zen looks like, it in many ways expresses sort of the limitations that are socioeconomic. It expresses limitations around access that people have. It expresses the limitations of, where centers are located, and what kinds of relationships we have amongst people of different races and cultures and classes. So it looks like that, but it also looks like, this beautiful expression of, some other era. You can wake up one day and be in a retreat and really believe that you're in medieval Japan, because we have many of the same garbs. They're part of the outfits that we wear, and and so it's this mashup. I think it's a mashup. It is a modern mashup that expresses both the history, the lineage, the origin, from the spontaneity of Taoism, to the very mundane need for monasteries to pay their way through life in American society.
I think you've described beautifully what we are actually hoping to trigger, at least to some point, in visitors. Of course, we don't want to convert anybody, but we do. I do have the hope that an exhibition, particularly about Zen, will, like it was with my own experience going to Japan. I found out things about myself that I didn't know I was looking for. Just encountering and engaging with the unknown, so to speak. And that is an experience that I wish for everybody, looking at these kinds of artworks that we just scratched on a little bit today. I think we're running slowly out of time, but I do want to pose one more question to Professor Lippit before we all start concluding today's session. How could you elaborate a little bit on the effect that traditional Zen art, Zen art may have had, or may not have had, on post-war artists like Klein, Cage, and people like that?
Well, sure. Zen was embraced by many artists, even from slightly before the war, but especially, as you say, in post-war America. And what's fascinating about aspects of this embrace is the concept of the psyche and the unconscious, which is a modern idea, and which is 40, 50 years old by the time people like John Cage encounter Zen. And the way they understand Zen in some ways as kind of accessing and mining the unconscious, which is a framework for understanding a more historical effort to get out of the framework of the mind itself, which is the center of what generates illusion and desire in the world, and is so difficult to grasp. How do you grasp the concept of mind and escape it with the mind? How do you provisionally put that in play and put yourself outside it? And for artists like Cage and others, it was more, I think, maybe framed in terms of understanding and engaging the unconscious and engaging chance. And so they really, in an interesting way, kind of used it as a platform for artistic. Zen gave a kind of you might say platform, a kind of a traditional starting point, a starting point located outside of Western culture for some of the artistic experimentations that they were interested. So it was a really interesting confluence, interesting resonance or cultural meeting point, you might say.
Well, in many ways, today's age of Zoom is a little bit like this. We are transcending a lot of things. And Reverend Angel in San Francisco and Professor Lippit in Cambridge, and I am wherever I am. And thank you very much. And I would like, we're already at our limit today, so I would like to ask Reverend Angel to end today's session with another mindful moment, if you may.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you for all of the questions and really the very, very vibrant discussion. We had an opportunity to be here before today. And so I can tell you that Professor Lippit is really fascinating fountain of knowledge, and Frank's genuine interest is very stimulating. So I'm going to use this moment to bring myself into my own internal investigation and curiosity. And so we can do these practices or have these types of experiences where there's a lot of mental activity. And so it's nice to end these times to just return and allow ourselves to reconnect with the fundamental trust that all of the questions that we have that will live with us, and even if they're not formally answered, that they inform our sense of curiosity and openness. And one way we can do that is once again by finding and engaging with our breath. As we let the energy of questions and intellectual pursuit just kind of soften, as we allow our skin to soften. Bringing our, I like to say, attention awareness to our breath as it rests in our belly. Giving us an anchor to return to as our mind, as it is habituated to do, chases after things and grasps. We can invite the mind and attention awareness to come back again and to rest once again in our belly. Bringing our attention awareness to the sensations of the clothing on our skin, the rise and fall of our chest or belly, with no need or intention to control the breath, just to allow it to simply rest. And as we notice attention drifting into to-do lists, into the future, lagging behind in the past, we can invite the breath back as if we're holding it in the palm of our hand, resting in our belly. Coaxing it back gently. And in this way, aligned with our breath, attention, resting, we draw our own sense of present fully into this moment. Fully into this moment in which we can appreciate our curiosity, we can appreciate our wonder, we can appreciate our not knowing. We can appreciate our challenges, we can appreciate all of the things that we're all navigating in this time of uncertainty. We can appreciate all of the experiences that are true for us in this moment and in this particular time. And for just these moments, we don't have to do anything with those pieces of information that course through our bodies, that course through our minds. We can just rest and invite an open and spacious awareness that as our life unfolds and we assign meaning and narrative and story, which is what we do, that we can also invite moments of just being present. Just being present with sensation, with emotion, with energy, with feeling, and let them be simply as they are. Unhooked from stories, unhooked from ideas. There's just breath. Resting in belly. In just this moment, we can rest and allow for this moment is all that matters. We can rest in the presence, we can rest in now. Until next time. Thank you so much for your attention. And may each of you go well in your days, in the days to come.
I would like to thank our guests, Reverend Angel, Professor Lippit, and Frank Feltons, for sharing their thoughts and expertise with us this evening. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us from home and for your comments, especially one who wrote in the comment section, "Art can provide answers to questions you didn't even know you had." I thought that was very meaningful. We hope to see you back here next week on July 29th at 6 p.m. for the next talk in this series, Conversations about Museums and Healing, featuring an interview with Smithsonian Secretary Loni Bunch and a conversation with journalist Krista Tippett. Until then, peace to all and stay safe.